March 1986. The thin, cold air over the Hindu Kush. A solitary, unmarked Boeing RC-135U flies a precise, elliptical orbit just south of the Soviet-Afghan border. Inside, the ambient hum is broken only by the soft click of tape reels and the murmur of linguists wearing headphones. Their eyes are fixed on scrolling spectral displays. They are listening to a war 40,000 feet below. On a secure, encrypted frequency, a Soviet Mi-24 Hind helicopter pilot radios his command post. He reports a successful rocket strike on a suspected Mujahideen supply column in the Panjshir Valley. He gives coordinates, ammunition status, a request for further orders. Seconds later, that same encrypted transmission, now decrypted and translated, is being analyzed by an American signals intelligence officer in the RC-135U's cabin. A geolocation fix is plotted on a map. A report is formatted. The secret conversation of the Soviet 40th Army, in its entirety, is being siphoned from the sky. This was not random intercept. This was a targeted, technological hunt, and its success would send a tremor through the highest levels of the Soviet General Staff, revealing a vulnerability they never knew they had. The silent war for information had begun, and America held the key. March 1986. The thin, cold air over the Hindu Kush. A solitary, unmarked Boeing RC-135U flies a precise, elliptical orbit just south of the Soviet-Afghan border. Inside, the ambient hum is broken only by the soft click of tape reels and the murmur of linguists wearing headphones. Their eyes are fixed on scrolling spectral displays. They are listening to a war 40,000 feet below. On a secure, encrypted frequency, a Soviet Mi-24 Hind helicopter pilot radios his command post. He reports a successful rocket strike on a suspected Mujahideen supply column in the Panjshir Valley. He gives coordinates, ammunition status, a request for further orders. Seconds later, that same encrypted transmission, now decrypted and translated, is being analyzed by an American signals intelligence officer in the RC-135U's cabin. A geolocation fix is plotted on a map. A report is formatted. The secret conversation of the Soviet 40th Army, in its entirety, is being siphoned from the sky. This was not random intercept. This was a targeted, technological hunt, and its success would send a tremor through the highest levels of the Soviet General Staff, revealing a vulnerability they never knew they had. The silent war for information had begun, and America held the key. This extraordinary eavesdropping operation did not emerge from a vacuum. It was the product of a calculated, years-long American response to a seismic geopolitical shift, the Soviet Union's violent lunge into Central Asia. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979 was a blunt instrument wielded with chilling swiftness. It was not a declaration of war, but a fraternal assistance to a collapsing communist ally. Columns of BMD infantry fighting vehicles, their tracks clattering on the ironwork, rolled across the Friendship Bridge over the Amu Darya River at Termez. Behind them came the roar of IL-76 transports disgorging the core of the 40th Army. The objective was simple: secure cities, highways and airfields, eliminate the unreliable Afghan leader Hafizullah Amin, and install a compliant puppet, Babrak Karmal. Moscow believed it was executing a complex political military operation, a surgical insertion of force to stabilize a client state. They expected to be greeted as liberators by a populace weary of Amin's tyranny, and they anticipated a short, decisive campaign. The Politburo's consensus was that the major combat units would withdraw within a year, leaving behind a secure, socialist Afghanistan governed from Kabul. This confidence was catastrophically misplaced. The invasion instantly ignited a nationwide insurgency, rooted in centuries of tribal independence and deep Islamic faith. The Mujahideen, the holy warriors, were not a unified army, but a constellation of fractious, regionally based factions. Yet they shared a common enemy. They melted into the landscape they knew intimately: the labyrinthine valleys of the Panjshir, the barren mountains of Kandahar, the fortified villages of Logar. The Soviet military, a mechanized juggernaut designed for continental war against NATO on the plains of Europe, found itself in a topographic and cultural quagmire. The initial Soviet tactics reflected this doctrinal mismatch. They launched large-scale conventional sweeps, zakistki or cleansing operations, using battalion-sized formations supported by artillery and helicopter gunships. They would seal a valley, conduct methodical searches, and engage any resistance with overwhelming firepower. The results were tactically successful but strategically hollow. The Mujahideen simply dispersed, ceding the valley floor, and watched from the high ground. Soviet convoys, strung out on the few paved roads like beads on a string, were ambushed with chilling regularity. The Hind helicopter gunship, the Mi-24, became the ubiquitous symbol of Soviet power, a flying armored vehicle that could deliver rockets, cannon fire, and troops. But even the Hind had its limits in the high-altitude heat, and it was vulnerable to the increasing number of man-portable air defense systems, or MANPADS, beginning to trickle into rebel hands. By 1982, a grim stalemate had settled over Afghanistan. The Soviets controlled the urban centers and the major ring road. The Mujahideen controlled the countryside and the population. The war devolved into a brutal attritional grind. Soviet forces grew increasingly reliant on deep interdiction strikes, attempting to sever the Mujahideen's supply lines from Pakistan. This required precise intelligence. Where were the supply caravans forming? Where were the rebel base camps? What were Soviet troop movements and intentions to enable effective ambushes? The KGB and GRU ran networks of agents, and reconnaissance units conducted perilous missions, but the human intelligence was patchy, unreliable, and often fatal to acquire. The real intelligence lifeblood of the Soviet war machine was its electronic communications, the encrypted radio nets linking helicopter pilots to forward air controllers, Spetsnaz teams to headquarters, and artillery batteries to observation posts. This stream of encrypted data was the central nervous system of the 40th Army. The Soviets operated with the assumption that this system was secure. Their encryption, while not unbreakable, was sophisticated. The vast empty spaces of Afghanistan, they believed, provided a natural shield against interception. They were confident that even if signals leaked, they would be drowned in the noise of the ionosphere, or be indecipherable without the proper cipher keys. This confidence in the secrecy of their tactical communications was a critical pillar of their operational security. It was a pillar the United States was already preparing to topple. Not from within Afghanistan, but from the sterile, high-altitude corridors of international airspace. While Soviet paratroopers were securing Kabul's airport, a parallel mobilization was occurring 7,000 miles away, within the windowless offices of the Pentagon, the CIA's Langley headquarters, and the National Security Agency at Fort Meade. The American intelligence community watched the invasion not merely as a regional crisis, but as a once-in-a-generation intelligence opportunity. For the first time since the Korean War, a modern Soviet combined arms army was deploying en masse for sustained combat. This was not an exercise, not a parade, but the real, unvarnished application of Soviet military doctrine, technology, and command practice. Every radio transmission, every radar emission, every logistic report was a priceless data point. The war in Afghanistan became an open-air laboratory, and the United States was determined to install the most sensitive listening devices possible. The primary challenge was one of geography and access. Afghanistan was a denied area, deep inside the Soviet sphere of influence. Human intelligence was perilous and limited. Satellites could provide imagery of airfields and troop concentrations, but they could not capture the real-time electronic heartbeat of the Soviet military. The solution, as it had been for decades, lay in airborne signals intelligence, or SIGINT. But the existing fleet of reconnaissance aircraft like the aging RC-135 variants and the U-2 were optimized for strategic collection against fixed Soviet air defense networks and missile tests. They were not configured for the dynamic, tactical, and highly encrypted communications of a fluid counterinsurgency battlefield. A new, agile, and deeply secretive capability was required. The order went to the Pentagon's most clandestine acquisition and operations office, Big Safari. Established in 1952, the Big Safari program was the Special Forces unit of airborne reconnaissance. It operated outside normal procurement bureaucracy with a singular mandate: rapidly modify existing aircraft with cutting-edge, mission-specific intelligence-gathering suites. Its name implied a hunt. Its ethos was velocity and precision. When a unique intelligence gap emerged, Big Safari was tasked to close it. They were the engineers of the invisible, turning airframes like the C-130, the U-2 and the RC-135 into flying Swiss Army knives of electronic surveillance. The program reported directly to the highest levels of the Air Force and the intelligence community, its budget and operations shrouded in black secrecy. The intelligence requirement for Afghanistan was clear: penetrate the Soviet tactical communications shield. This meant developing an aircraft that could loiter for extended periods on the periphery of the conflict zone, sweep up vast swathes of radio spectrum, and, critically, defeat Soviet encryption in near real time. The platform chosen was the RC-135, a militarized version of the Boeing 707. Its size, endurance, and power generation made it ideal. Only two were ever built. Their distinctive feature was a grotesque array of bulging radomes and blade antennas protruding from the fuselage, giving them a sinister insect-like profile. Each protrusion housed a different sensor system designed to locate, characterize, and intercept electronic emissions. But hardware was only half the battle. The true breakthrough was in cryptologic capability. The NSA, in a monumental and ongoing effort, had made significant inroads into Soviet military encryption systems. By the mid-1980s, they could decrypt a substantial portion of the tactical communications used by Soviet forces in Afghanistan, not through brute force computation, which was impossible with the era's technology, but through a combination of theoretical mathematics, cipher key management flaws discovered in other theaters, and operational mistakes by Soviet radio operators in the field. This decryption capability was not instantaneous, but it was fast enough to be operationally relevant, often within minutes or hours of intercept. By 1984, the pieces were in place. A uniquely modified aircraft flown by a hand-picked Big Safari crew, equipped with the NSA's latest cryptologic suites, and directed by an insatiable demand for intelligence on the Soviet war. The stage was set for a silent offensive. The mission was not to drop bombs, but to harvest secrets. Each flight of the RC-135U Combat Scent was a deep probe into the mind of the Soviet war machine, a deliberate act of intellectual theft designed to unravel the enemy's operations from the inside out. The Americans were preparing to listen to the Soviet war in a way its own generals could scarcely imagine. This fusion of clandestine engineering and cryptologic genius created not just a listening post, but a weapon of strategic insight. To understand its full impact, we must examine it from multiple perspectives. The success of the eavesdropping missions over Afghanistan did not hinge on machines alone. It was a human enterprise cultivated within one of the most secretive and elite ecosystems of the Cold War, the Big Safari program. To step into this world was to leave standard military procedure behind. Its personnel were not just airmen and engineers, they were mavericks, problem solvers, and keepers of the impossible. The program's culture was forged in the fires of the Cold War's most urgent crises. During the Berlin airlift, it modified C-54s to count Soviet radar pulses. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, it fielded modified C-130s to intercept Soviet communications. Each event reinforced its mandate. When a national security emergency demanded a unique eyes and ears platform, Big Safari would build it, bypassing years of standard procurement. By the 1980s, it was a tight-knit cabal of several hundred people, based primarily at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, and operating from forward locations like Kadena Air Base in Okinawa and Hellinikon Air Base in Greece. The crews who flew the EAS RC-135U Combat Scent missions were not typical reconnaissance officers. They were volunteers, subjected to intense polygraph tests and background investigations. Their training was continuous and compartmentalized. A pilot might know the aircraft's exotic flight characteristics for long-endurance orbits, but not the full capability of the signal suite behind his cockpit wall. The mission crew, the electronic warfare officers, EWOs, the linguists, the cryptologic technicians, were often civilians or military personnel seconded from the NSA. They were selected for linguistic fluency, technical aptitude, and a temperament suited to the patient, analytical chaos of the intercept cabin. For these men and women, a mission over the Afghan periphery was a physically and mentally draining marathon. Flights could last over 12 hours. The cabin, lined with racks of now archaic analog spectrum analyzers, tape recorders, and processing gear, was a cacophony of electronic noise and focused whispers. Linguists with headphones clamped to their ears listened for specific call signs, their fingers poised over reel-to-reel recorders, EWOs, monitoring panoramic displays that painted the electromagnetic spectrum as a waterfall of light, hunted for new frequencies, new patterns of emission. The atmosphere was one of intense, quiet pressure. They weren't just collecting raw signals, they were conducting a live diagnostic on the Soviet 40th Army. A sudden burst of encrypted traffic from a previously quiet grid square could indicate a helicopter assault forming up. A shift in artillery fire direction net protocols might signal a new offensive. They had to recognize these patterns in real time, tasking the aircraft's sensitive antennas for a closer look. The organizational spine of this effort was Big Safari's legendary logistics and modification chain. If a new Soviet radio system was identified in Afghanistan, the NSA would develop an intercept and processing algorithm. Big Safari engineers would then design a hardware modification, a new antenna, a processor rack to exploit it. This kit would be fabricated in secure workshops and flown to the RC-135U's forward operating location. The modification would be installed in days, sometimes hours, by a team that traveled with the aircraft. This cycle of intelligence driving rapid engineering was a closed loop of immense power. The aircraft was never static. It evolved in near real time to meet the evolving threat. This agility stood in stark contrast to the Soviet military's own bureaucratic, top-heavy procurement system. The human cost was measured in fatigue and perpetual secrecy. Crews operated undercover stories. The operational stress was compounded by the ever-present threat, however mitigated by distance, of Soviet long-range aviation or air defense systems misidentifying them. They flew in international airspace, but their mission was an act of technological aggression. S-Command and, crucially, into the pipeline of intelligence being shared with the Pakistani Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI, for dissemination to the Mujahideen. The Big Safari personnel were the silent conductors of this orchestra of intelligence, their work translating the opaque chatter of Soviet pilots into actionable death warrants for Hind helicopters and supply convoys. The RC-135U Combat Cent was not merely an aircraft with antennas. It was a bespoke instrument of electronic dissection. Its iconic and unsettling external appearance, a sleek Boeing 707 airframe disfigured by bulbous, asymmetrical radomes on its chin, cheekbones, and tail, was a direct map of its internal mission. Each protrusion served a specific compartmentalized function in the hunt for Soviet emissions. This was a machine built not for aerodynamics, but for electromagnetic dominance. The most critical systems were its precision direction finding, DF arrays. Multiple clusters of antennas, spaced across the fuselage, allowed the aircraft to perform triangulation. When a Soviet radar or radio transmitter emitted a signal, the slight difference in the time it reached each antenna cluster was measured with nanosecond precision. Through complex processing, the RC-135U could plot the location of that emitter on a map, often within a radius of a few kilometers. This meant that when a Soviet MiG-23's High Lark radar painted the aircraft from across the border, or when a ground-based Spoon Rest early warning radar scanned the horizon, the Combat Cent could not only identify the type of radar, but pinpoint its exact coordinates. This electronic order of battle was invaluable, but the true prize was in the communications spectrum. Internally, the aircraft was a labyrinth of black boxes and cooling ducts. Rows of receivers could sweep across vast segments of radio frequency, from very high frequency VHF, used for tactical air-to-ground chatter, to ultra-high frequency UHF for satellite links and senior command nets. The intercepted signals were routed to two primary processing streams. The first was for encrypted voice and data. These signals were digitized and, using pre-positioned cryptographic keys and algorithms developed by the NSA, run through dedicated decryptor hardware. The second stream was for in-the-clear or lightly obfuscated communications, which linguists could monitor directly. The cabin layout was designed for this analytical triage, linguists in one section handling clear traffic, cryptologic technicians in another monitoring the decryptor outputs, and EWOs in a third managing the overall collection strategy and directing the antenna operators. Operationally, a mission followed a meticulously choreographed script. Taking off from a forward base like Hellinikon in Greece or Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, the RC-135U would climb to its operational altitude, often above 35,000 feet, where its line of sight to the Afghan battlefield was maximized. It would then establish an orbit, a gentle, racetrack-shaped pattern just outside the borders of the Soviet Union or its allies, typically over international airspace above Pakistan or the Arabian Sea. Its orbit was a calculated balance, close enough to capture faint line-of-sight tactical signals from within Afghanistan, but far enough to remain outside the engagement envelope of most Soviet surface-to-air missile systems. Once on station, the hunt began. Mission profiles were often tailored to specific Soviet operations. If intelligence suggested a major offensive in the Panjshir Valley, the combat cent would focus its arrays on that region, listening for the activation of command nets, the increased traffic of helicopter and close air support frequencies, and the distinct signatures of artillery fire direction radars. The crew worked with cue sheets, lists of known Soviet frequencies, call signs, and radio operator fists, the unique tapping style of a Morse code operator. They were listening not just for words, but for patterns. A sudden increase in encrypted traffic preceding a dawn raid, the specific jargon used by Spetsnaz controllers calling in airstrikes, the logistical codes for fuel and ammunition resupply that revealed forward operating base locations. The technological crown jewel, however, was the near real-time processing. It was this capability that transformed the RC-135U from a recorder of events into a predictor of them. When a Soviet flight of Hinds took off from Jalalabad airfield, their pilots would check in on a regimental command net. The combat cent would intercept, decrypt, and geolocate that transmission. The linguist might hear the pilot's mission brief, a troop insertion in a specific valley. Within minutes, that intelligence, fused with the coordinates, could be formatted into a flash priority message. This message would be transmitted via secure satellite link not only to Washington, but directly to a CIA field station in Pakistan. The process from Soviet pilot's mouth to Mujahideen commander's ear could, in critical instances, take less than an hour. The technological loop was closed with devastating effect. The Soviet commander believed he was communicating securely over encrypted channels in a remote theater. He was, in fact, broadcasting his intentions into a room where his enemy was not only listening, but taking meticulous notes and relaying them to the guerrillas waiting in the mountains below. This relentless, technologically enabled eavesdropping created a vast repository of intimate knowledge. But the true seismic shock for the Soviets occurred when this intelligence reached its climax, revealing not just tactical secrets, but the operational soul of their failing war effort. The turning point was not a single battle, but a cascading series of revelations, compiled over months of silent observation. The climax of the Big Safari operation arrived when the intercepted communications ceased being merely tactical and began to paint an unbearable strategic portrait, a portrait of deep systemic failure, visible only to those listening from the outside. A pivotal series of missions in the spring and summer of 1986 provided this damning evidence, focusing on two critical and vulnerable components of the Soviet war machine: close air support and special operations. One recurring intercept pattern involved the Soviet FAC-A network, the Forward Air Controller Aircraft Communications. The RC-135U crews became intimately familiar with the voices and call signs of Soviet pilots flying Su-25 Frogfoot, ground attack aircraft and Mi-24 Hind helicopter gunships. They documented a rising tone of frustration and fear in these encrypted exchanges. Pilots ordered to conduct low-altitude strafing runs in narrow valleys would report intense and accurate ground fire, followed by evasive maneuvers and, increasingly, mayday calls. The intercepts allowed American analysts to map the expanding Man-Pads belt, the areas where Stinger and other shoulder-fired missiles supplied by the CIA had been distributed to the Mujahideen. But beyond the map, the transcripts revealed a collapse in pilot morale and tactical confidence. The sacred Soviet principle of aviation support on demand for ground troops was breaking down. Pilots began questioning controller orders, requesting permission to abort attacks due to perceived threats, and showing a reluctance to enter known hot zones. This hesitation, captured in real time, it's only a stunt, was a critical vulnerability. An army reliant on aerial firepower was losing its nerve in the sky. Simultaneously, the combat sense direction-finding arrays were tracking the communications of Soviet Spetsnaz and airborne assault units with unprecedented precision. These elite forces were the scalpel of the 40th Army, tasked with deep raids, ambushes, and the interdiction of Mujahideen supply caravans. Their success depended on stealth, surprise, and secure communications. The RC-135U shattered that last pillar. A meticulously planned Spetsnaz operation in the Logar province in July 1986 demonstrated this. For days prior, the aircraft orbiting to the south monitored an increase in dedicated low probability of intercept (LPI) radio traffic between a known GRU headquarters in Kabul and a remote sector of the province. The pattern suggested a unit insertion and the establishment of an observation post. On the night of the planned ambush, the Spetsnaz team reported their final positioning and readiness, using a burst transmission device meant to minimize their electronic signature. The combat scent captured it. More critically, they intercepted the subsequent, more routine logistics traffic, a helicopter resupply request for the following morning that included the grid coordinates for a food and water drop. This transmission, less rigorously secured, was decrypted rapidly. The coordinates were not the ambush site itself, but a landing zone a few kilometers away, a fatal operational security lapse. This intelligence was fused with other intercepts and imagery, forming a near-complete picture of the Spetsnaz team's location, strength, and timetable. The information was channeled through the CIA to the relevant Mujahideen commander in Logar. The result was not an ambush of a Mujahideen column, but a counter-ambush. The Soviet Spetsnaz team found itself surrounded and engaged by a larger, prepared Mujahideen force. In the frantic, encrypted firefight that followed, the combat scent recorded the entire desperate drama. The initial contact reports filled with shock, the calls for immediate close air support, the chaotic updates as positions were overrun, and finally, the grim casualty reports and the request for a medevac extraction of the wounded. The mission was a total tactical failure for the Soviets. For the American listeners, it was a validation of overwhelming potency. They had not just intercepted a message, they had orchestrated a battlefield defeat from 40,000 feet, proving they could reach into the Soviet command chain at its most sensitive, elite level and turn its own communications against it. The most profound shock, however, came from intercepts that had nothing to do with bullets or missiles. They concerned the soul of the army. The RC-135U regularly monitored the Soviet morale and welfare networks. The families traffic where officers and conscripts were allowed occasional monitored calls back to the USSR. The linguistic and cryptologic teams became students of Soviet despair. They transcribed soldiers' whispered complaints about rotten food, incompetent officers, and the terror of night guard duty. They listened to junior officers confiding in wives about the futility of their missions, the brutality of their own tactics, and the pervasive corruption that saw fuel and ammunition sold on the black market to the very enemy they were fighting. These were not tactical secrets, but human truths. They revealed an army rotting from within, plagued by drug, the Russian word for fever or plague, a term that came to encompass the whole sickening experience of Afghanistan. This intelligence was perhaps the most valuable of all. It confirmed that the technological and tactical advantages revealed by the intercepts were underpinned by a catastrophic collapse in will. The Soviet war machine was not just being outmaneuvered, it was bleeding out psychologically, and its agonized murmurs were being captured on American tape reels. The collection of this intelligence was a monumental achievement in itself. But its true power and the moment of genuine shock for the Soviet High Command came in its dissemination and eventual inadvertent exposure. The intelligence harvested by the combat scent did not remain in a vault. It entered a voracious distribution pipeline, where its impact was immediate and multiplicative. This process transformed raw intercepts into a strategic weapon that bled the Soviet 40th Army daily. The realization of this breach, when it finally dawned on the Soviet High Command, would provoke a crisis of confidence that echoed from the Hindu Kush to the halls of the Kremlin. The pipeline operated on 3 tiers. The first was tactical and direct. Through the CIA's Covert Action Network, managed with the Pakistani ISI, critical, time-sensitive intelligence was fed to Mujahideen commanders. The Mujahideen used this not just to set ambushes, but to avoid them. They learned when and where Soviet sweep operations were forming, allowing them to disperse or reinforce accordingly. The psychological effect on the Mujahideen was transformative. They began to believe they had divine insight, a mirage, ascension, that let them see the enemy's plans. For the Soviet soldier, the effect was its inverse, a creeping, paranoid certainty that the enemy was always one step ahead, that the very mountains had eyes and ears loyal to the guerrillas. Military and intelligence agencies. The NSA and the Defense Intelligence Agency compiled the intercepts into comprehensive studies: Soviet tactical communications security in a counterinsurgency environment, morale indicators in the 40th Army, efficiency of Soviet close air support coordination. These reports did more than catalogue failures. They exposed fundamental doctrinal flaws. American analysts learned that Soviet encrypted nets were often too rigid. In fast-moving combat, units would switch to simpler, unencrypted frequencies for speed, a fatal compromise the combat scent eagerly exploited. They documented the slow, bureaucratic process for changing cryptographic keys, which left systems vulnerable for predictable windows. They mapped the entire chain of command, identifying which generals were aggressive, which were cautious, and which were reporting falsified, optimistic metrics to Moscow. Understanding of the Soviet military but directly informed the design of American weapons and tactics for a potential European conflict. The Soviet army being bloodied in Afghanistan was the same one NATO would face. Its weaknesses, now laid bare, were priceless. The third and most sensitive tier was political. Summaries of the intercepts, particularly those revealing the grim reality of Soviet casualties, plummeting morale, and institutional corruption, reached the desks of the National Security Advisor and the President. This intelligence gave the Reagan administration an unshakable confidence in its strategy. They knew with a certainty no satellite photo could provide that the Soviet war effort was hollow. It allowed them to calibrate the pressure perfectly, to increase Stinger shipments when intercepts showed aerial dominance was cracking, to ramp up propaganda campaigns highlighting Soviet soldier disillusionment, and to hold firm in diplomatic channels knowing the USSR was bearing an unsustainable cost. The Soviet realization of this catastrophic compromise did not come from a single defector or a captured document. It came from a pattern of losses so consistent, so inexplicably precise, that it could only point to a deep signals intelligence breach. The first suspicions likely festered within the KGB residenturas in Pakistan and the Middle East, noting the uncanny timing of Mujahideen operations. But the damning evidence is believed to have come from two sources. First, from the Mujahideen themselves. In the fog of war, captives sometimes boasted of their foreknowledge. Second, and more decisively, from compromised Western communications, and Pakistan. While they could not penetrate the RC-135U's own secure links, they could piece together circumstantial evidence from lower-level CIA and ISI communications. By late 1986 and into 1987, the shockwave reached the Soviet General Staff. Senior generals in the Main Intelligence Directorate, GRU, and Communications Command were presented with analytical reports that mirrored, in a dark inverse, the American ones. Their conclusions were inescapable. The tactical communications security of the 40th Army had been comprehensively penetrated. The enemy was not just listening, they were decrypting operational traffic in near real time. For officers steeped in the dogma of technical parity with the West, this was a profound humiliation. It meant their most advanced tactical encryption, the very glue of their combined arms operations, was effectively transparent. It explained the failed ambushes, the preempted offensives, the shocking effectiveness of Stinger ambushes that seemed to know exactly when and where helicopters would appear. The initial reaction was one of denial, then fury, followed by a frantic and disjointed effort to respond. Emergency orders were dispatched to Afghanistan mandating a complete overhaul of communications security protocols. New cryptographic keys were issued. Units were ordered to maintain encryption at all costs, even at the expense of operational tempo. Suspicion turned inward, with security officers, Osobisti, investigating their own signal troops for potential compromise or treason. But the changes were like trying to rebuild a dam while the flood was already raging through the breach. The tactical habits of 6 years of war could not be unlearned overnight. The existing stockpile of encryption devices could not be instantly replaced. The Big Safari operation had achieved what all intelligence operations strive for. It had not just stolen secrets, it had degraded the enemy's trust in his own systems, injecting a paralyzing toxin of doubt into the Soviet command structure at the very moment it needed clarity and resolve most. This crisis of confidence, born from the silent ears in the sky, directly shaped the final bloody years of the Soviet occupation, accelerating the political decision to withdraw and dictating the desperate tactics of a retreating superpower. The Soviet military, upon confronting the reality of the communications breach, entered a period of frantic and often counterproductive adaptation. The initial response was a tsunami of directives from Moscow and the General Staff, imposing draconian new signals security (SIGSEC) regulations on the 40th Army in the field. The order was simple: encrypt everything at all times. Radios that had often slipped to less secure modes for the sake of speed in combat were now to remain on high-grade encryption, regardless of tactical urgency. The frequency hopping patterns for more advanced sets were to be changed daily, even hourly in some high-risk units. A new layer of procedural complexity descended upon an already overburdened, conscript-heavy force. The effect was immediate operational friction. The swift coordination between helicopter gunships and ground troops, a relative Soviet strength, began to slow. Pilots, awaiting encrypted confirmation of target coordinates, circled longer in hostile skies. Artillery support, which relied on rapid fire direction, became more cumbersome. The rigid adherence to secure communications often broke down at the point of maximum danger, when a unit was in close contact and needed immediate help. Junior officers facing annihilation would revert to open broadcasts, screaming for support. These desperate, unencrypted cries were, of course, eagerly collected by the orbiting combat cent, providing fresh confirmation of the continued breach and often the precise location of a unit in distress. The Soviet attempt to seal the leak had, in many cases, simply made the army clumsier, while the most critical and vulnerable communications still bled into the ether. A more profound tactical shift was the forced move away from radio-dependent special operations and toward brute force, large-scale methods. The spectacular failure of targeted Spetsnaz missions, which relied on stealth and surprise, now deemed compromised, led to their curtailment. In their place, the Soviets doubled down on what they called the scorched earth policy. This involved massive, division-sized operations using relentless artillery barrages and saturation bombing from high-altitude bombers like the Tu-16 Badger, which operated outside the range of Stingers. The objective was no longer to surgically interdict supply lines, but to render entire regions uninhabitable, destroying villages, irrigation systems, and farmland to depopulate areas sympathetic to the Mujahideen. Operations like the 1987 offensives in the provinces of Paktia and Khost exemplified this shift. While devastating, these methods were politically costly, generated worldwide condemnation, and further alienated the Afghan population. They were the tactics of a frustrated power, substituting overwhelming firepower for the finesse it could no longer trust itself to execute. Strategically, the intelligence hemorrhage accelerated a paralysis already gripping the Soviet leadership. The Politburo, receiving sanitized reports from the military, had long been insulated from the war's grim reality. But by 1987, the evidence from SIGINT and other sources was too stark to ignore. The intercepted morale traffic, the operational failures, the clear picture of a stalemate, all fed directly into the arguments of reformers like Mikhail Gorbachev. He had come to power in 1985 seeking to restructure the Soviet system, perestroika, and was increasingly convinced that Afghanistan was a bleeding wound, as he would famously call it. The big Safari intercepts provided the empirical battlefield proof that the wound was not just bleeding, but septic. They showed that pouring more troops and equipment into the theatre was futile when the enemy could anticipate every move. This intelligence directly influenced the critical Politburo meetings in late 1986 and 1987, where the decision for a phased withdrawal was cemented. The generals could no longer credibly argue that victory was around the corner or that new tactics would turn the tide. The Americans, through their silent surveillance, had called their bluff. The Soviet leadership now faced a war with two fronts, one against the Mujahideen in the mountains and another against a ghostly, omniscient adversary who lived in their radio waves. Fighting the first was difficult. Fighting the second was impossible. Thus, the announcement in April 1988 of the Geneva Accords, committing the USSR to a full withdrawal by February 1989, was not merely a political decision. It was a military admission. The 40th Army would now fight a long, bloody fighting retreat, prioritizing the preservation of its remaining forces and equipment. Their communications during this perilous exodus became more regimented, more careful, but the shadow of the listener remained. Every convoy movement, every rearguard action was planned with the grim assumption that the enemy might already know. The psychological advantage had irrevocably shifted. The Soviet army was not just leaving Afghanistan, it was fleeing the penetrating gaze of an intelligence capability that had seen its innermost workings laid bare. While the Soviets grappled with defeat, the American Big Safari program and its technological progeny entered a new era, their success in Afghanistan having profound and lasting implications for the future of warfare and intelligence. As the last Soviet armored column recrossed the Friendship Bridge in February 1989, the RC-135U Combat sent aircraft concluded their intensive focus on Afghanistan. But for the Big Safari program and the signals intelligence architecture it represented, the war had been a transformative proving ground. The success validated a ruthless model of intelligence-driven, rapid acquisition and created a template for future conflicts. The legacy of those missions over the Hindu Kush extended far beyond the collapse of the Soviet 40th Army. It reshaped the American way of electronic war. The immediate legacy was institutional and budgetary. The black budget governing special access programs like Big Safari, already substantial, grew in influence and scope. The demonstrated ability to decrypt and exploit Soviet tactical communications in near real time was a trump card of incalculable value. It justified massive, ongoing investment in next-generation cryptanalysis, supercomputing, and space-based SIGINT. The lessons learned about Soviet electronic order of battle, radar tolerances, and command net vulnerabilities were baked into the planning for a potential NATO-Warsaw Pact war in Europe. Army doctrine evolved with a newfound emphasis on exploiting adversary communications as a center of gravity. The operational model, a high-altitude, persistent platform with onboard linguists and near real-time processing, became the gold standard. It led directly to the development of the RC-135 rivet joint, the successor to the Combat Cent, which incorporated the lessons of Afghanistan into a more integrated digital system. More profoundly, it paved the conceptual runway for platforms that would dominate future conflicts, the E-8J STARS ground surveillance aircraft, and ultimately, the distributed network of sensors and shooters that would define the drone warfare of the 21st century. The idea that an aircraft could orbit safely, build a comprehensive picture of the battlefield from its electronic emissions, and directly enable lethal effects was proven over the mountains of Afghanistan. The human legacy was a generation of intelligence professionals forged in this silent conflict. Linguists, cryptologists, and EWOs who cut their teeth on Soviet traffic from Kabul and Jalalabad moved on to other crises: the Gulf War, the Balkans, the global war on terror. They carried with them an ingrained understanding of the intimate connection between signals intelligence and tactical outcomes. The culture of Big Safari, agile, secretive, and relentlessly focused on solving specific, urgent intelligence gaps, became a coveted model within the defense and intelligence communities, influencing special projects units across multiple agencies. Yet, no secret of such magnitude remains sealed forever. The unraveling began slowly. In the early 1990s, with the Soviet Union dissolved, some veterans of the war began to speak and write. Soviet generals, in their memoirs, alluded to a pervasive belief that their communications had been compromised, though they often lacked the technical specifics. Western journalists and historians, piecing together the astonishing effectiveness of the Mujahideen at key moments, began to suspect a deeper intelligence component. The term Big Safari itself started to appear in aviation circles and declassified documents related to other aircraft modifications, hinting at the shadowy organization behind them. The most significant public confirmation came indirectly through political scandal and technological evolution. The end of the Cold War led to budget cuts and a consolidation of the intelligence community, causing fragments of information to surface. Analysts cross-referencing declassified CIA histories of the Afghan war with known RC-135 deployments could connect the dots. Furthermore, the eventual declassification of the Stinger missile program's success inevitably raised the question: how did the Mujahideen know where and when to deploy them so effectively? The answer pointed squarely to signals intelligence. While the specific capabilities of the RC-135U and the full extent of the NSA's decryption successes remain classified, the broad contours of the operation are now understood to be a pivotal, if silent, chapter of the conflict. This gradual revelation served as a stark lesson to America's future adversaries. Nations like China, Iran, and North Korea studied the Soviet experience in Afghanistan not just as a lesson in counterinsurgency failure, but as a masterclass in the vulnerabilities of centralized encrypted command networks against a technologically superior SIGINT foe. It drove a global race toward more secure, frequency-hopping and burst transmission communications, and more recently, toward quantum encryption. The cat-and-mouse game initiated by Big Safari in the 1980s continues unabated, its playing field now expanded to cyberspace and low Earth orbit. The final ironic footnote is that the very success of this and similar programs created a dependency, an addiction to near-total informational dominance. This expectation would define American military operations for decades, but it also contained a latent vulnerability. The shock experienced by Soviet generals in the 1980s, when they realized their secure communications were transparent, would be a mirror image of the future shock awaiting any power that discovers its own technological edge has been quietly neutralized. The story of the Big Safari planes over Afghanistan is more than a tale of espionage. It is a lens through which to view the fundamental shift in modern conflict, where the battle for information became as decisive as the battle for terrain. The enduring image of the Soviet-Afghan war is one of visceral, brutal asymmetry. The Mi-24 Hind gunship against the Mujahideen on a rocky slope, the tank column against the ancient caravan route. It is a war remembered in steel and blood, in the geography of mountain passes and the politics of crumbling empires. Yet hovering at the edge of that picture, unseen and unheard, was another layer of conflict. A war fought in the electromagnetic spectrum, a silent contest of intellect and engineering that proved equally decisive. The American Big Safari RC-135U missions were more than an intelligence coup. They represented the maturation of a new principle in warfare, that the cognitive domain, the enemy's decision-making loop, his sense of security, his trust in his own systems, could be targeted as systematically as his tanks and troops. The Soviets were not defeated by a superior fighting force in direct confrontation. They were unraveled by a persistent, patient observation that turned their own operational rhythm against them. The shock experienced by Soviet generals was not merely at the loss of tactical surprise, but at the violation of a fundamental assumption of sovereignty. Their secure communications were their private command space, and it had been invaded. This silent war foreshadowed the central paradox of modern technological conflict. The same tools that grant a military unprecedented awareness, coordination, and precision, digital communications, encrypted networks, centralized command, also create profound vulnerabilities. They emit signatures. They rely on systems that can, with enough ingenuity and resource, be compromised. Afghanistan in the 1980s demonstrated that no encryption is eternal, no protocol perfectly secure against a dedicated, adaptive adversary. The conflict became a laboratory that proved information could be weaponized not just as propaganda, but as a direct, real-time combat multiplier. The legacy of those unmarked planes orbiting the Hindu Kush extends into our present. We live in an age defined by information dominance, by cyber warfare, by the constant, invisible contest for data. The principles proven over Afghanistan, persistent surveillance, rapid technical adaptation, the fusion of intelligence directly to the point of action, are the bedrock of contemporary drone campaigns and networked battlefields. The ghost of the RC-135U flies on in every predator feed and every signals intelligence satellite pass. Yet the closure of this story carries a sobering symmetry. The Soviet Union, for all its might, failed to understand the human terrain of Afghanistan and was blinded by its own technological arrogance regarding its secure communications. The lesson endures. Victory does not belong solely to the side with the most advanced listening devices or the fastest decryption algorithms. It belongs to the side that understands the deeper landscape, the human will, the cultural terrain, the political tides, and can wield its technological advantages with wisdom. The silent listeners over Afghanistan won a monumental battle in the shadows, but The war itself serves as an eternal reminder that no intelligence, however penetrating, can alone dictate the fate of nations. It is but one weapon in an arsenal that must include understanding, and without that, even the most stunning secret can become a footnote in a long, slow defeat.